Hi, I'm Joshua Farnsworth with Wood & Shop. Welcome to my traditional woodworking school here in Earlysville, Virginia. In this video, I'm going to talk about a major health scare that convinced me to start getting serious about dust collection in my workshop here. And I'll also talk about how I went about discovering and installing the best dust collection system. Recently I had a surgery that required a CT scan on my chest here. And after my surgery, the radiologist notified me that the CT scan showed unusual nodules on one of my lungs, which may be a sign of lung cancer. As you can imagine, this wasn't great news right after a surgery, or at any time for that matter. They told me that I would need another CT scan after a few months to see if the nodules were growing or if they'd shrunk or if they'd stayed the same. So during those several nerve-wracking months, I had a lot of time to think about what could have caused this issue. I figured that if I did have lung cancer, it wasn't from smoking because I've never smoked before, but it would have been caused by exposure to so much dust in my workshop. I had always used a dust collection system in all my workshops over the years, but I always did it as cheaply as possible. That might sound familiar to you. When you're fairly young, you think more about your budget than you do about health risks. So for years, I had been using cheap single-stage dust collectors because I figured that something like that would be better than no dust collection. And that's actually true, but it doesn't make it safe enough to prevent lung diseases caused by fine sawdust in your workshop. A few years ago, I had attempted to improve the air quality in my workshop by modifying my cheap single-stage grizzly dust collector into a DIY Cyclone System using a special lid and a trash can. By the way, Cyclone technology basically means that you're using a two-stage dust collection system where the bulk of the wood chips and sawdust are first dropped into a can, like a trash can, and then the finest particles are then carried away for filtration. This keeps your dust collector from having to filter all the big stuff and just focus on the fine dust that's dangerous. My DIY dust collection system seemed like it would work great in theory, but in reality, this system turned out to not work very well. No matter how much I modified the plastic lid, I just couldn't get it to do a good job at collecting most of the big wood chips and sawdust, so most of it was thrown at the air filter, so it was very inefficient. Also, my dust collector didn't have enough CFM to keep up with my machines. CFM is just a measurement of airflow. So both of these problems led to fine dust escaping through the air. And anyone who's used a cheap bag-style dust collector knows how much fine dust gets blown into the air every time you start up the dust collector. That's the fine dust. So the purpose of having a dust collector is kind of missed there. So this health scare finally motivated me to upgrade my dust collection system. After talking with friends and reading a lot of online reviews, I settled on the company Oneida Air Systems. Most dust collectors are made by companies that make 1,000 other woodworking products, but Oneida focuses only on dust collection. So for that reason, they're widely considered to be the leader in dust collection systems. And I think the majority of woodworkers believe that Oneida really does make the best dust collection system. I ordered the 5 horsepower Oneida Dusk Gorilla dust collector and a custom ductwork system. So I'll primarily talk about that dust collection system. But I'll also talk about some other Oneida dust collector systems for woodworking. And I'll even show you a cool, affordable option that'll work for upgrading your single-stage dust collector into a 2-stage Cyclone style dust collector. One that actually works, unlike my DIY attempt before. And if you want to stick around to the end, you can watch the fun process of installing my new dust collector system with the help of my kids. Before I had settled on a specific dust collection system with Oneida, they had asked me all about the specific machines in my workshop, all the dust port sizes, distances between machines, and the electrical power that I have available to my electrical panel. Once they understood all of this and my desired workshop flow, they finally recommended the 5 horsepower Dusk unit. You may not need this much horsepower in your workshop, but I have a large 16-inch jointer and planer machine that puts out, I would say, a serious volume of wood chips and sawdust, especially when I joint and plane really wide boards like this. This is the biggest wood dust producing machine in my workshop. My previous 1.5 horsepower dust collection system really struggled to keep up with the amount of wood that I put through it, and it would, a lot of dust would escape. But now I have so much dust collection power that I get virtually no chips or dust escaping my planer. And the high efficiency Cyclone of the Dusk Gorilla has a separation rate of over 99%. That's infinitely better than my DIY dust collection system. And as you can see here at the end of my dust collection ductwork, I can close the blast gate to my Felder machine and open the blast gate that runs a hose to my bandsaw. I've set up a custom system with hoses on the back of my bandsaw, and it works really well. Most bandsaws aren't designed very well for dust collection, but I have so much sucking power now with this Dusk Gorilla that I feel like it works pretty well. My other big dust collection requirement is on my table saw. I close the other blast gates and then go over to the ductwork near the Gorilla and open up this blast gate for my table saw. It runs down to my saw stop, table saw dust port. This Dusk Gorilla keeps up really well with the sawdust and wood chips that come down into the table saw cabinet. But my main challenge that I still need to remedy is collecting the sawdust that exits above the table saw. I've tried using the SawStop overarm dust collection system, as you can see here, but it does almost nothing to keep sawdust and wood chips from flying up into the air and into my lungs. I have plenty of suction power from the Dusk Gorilla, but SawStop system seems to be pretty flawed. SawStop also has a $500 floating overarm dust collection system, but I've heard a lot of people say that it also doesn't work really well. And it costs over $500. So that option is a no-go for me. So if the folks at Oneida are watching this, maybe you can make a good overarm table saw system for dust collection. That would be really awesome. Another exciting option that I designed with the Oneida engineers was a way to collect wood chips and sawdust from my lathe and drill press. I closed the table saw blast gate at this tower, and then I opened this one. I'm still experimenting with different vent hoods for the lathe and for the drill press, but this is a setup I have so far for my tools here. Down here is where the Dusk Gorilla expels the sawdust and wood chips. Some people will send the sawdust to an outside storage bin, which sounds really cool, but that wasn't an option for me with the side of my building. Because of the amount of wood that I mill up, I opted for the big 55-gallon steel drum as opposed to the 35-gallon drum. But either option is far superior to the frustrating plastic bags. You know what I'm talking about. Not only are the bags difficult to remove and replace, but they tear easily, and you get holes all the time. You can see that's why I have so much duct tape on my bags. And a really cool feature that came with my dust collector is the Dust Sentry bin fill level indicator. The sensor points down toward the sawdust in the drum, and a warning light lets me know when my drum is getting full. If you have your own barrel, you can certainly hook up this system with the Dusk Gorilla with some modifications. I also decided to mount my Dusk Gorilla to the wall, but other people opt for mounting it to a stand on the floor. And this here is the high quality filter where the finer dust goes after the big pieces dump into the drum. Whichever brand of dust collector you buy, make sure you get one that comes with a HEPA certified filter that filters the finest dust down to 0.3 microns. That's really small. I'm not going to pretend to be one of those smart engineer guys who spends hours comparing technical specifications between machines. I don't understand a lot of that stuff. I'm actually a pretty simple-minded guy, but there is one technical feature that I was able to understand that really stood out to me about this dust collection system. I'll try to explain it as simply as I can, or at least as best as I understand it. As I touched on earlier, air volume moving through a dust collection system is measured by CFM, or cubic feet per minute. Most dust collector systems for woodworking have motors that run at a fixed speed. This isn't very efficient, especially if your machines are far away from the dust collector in your shop, or if they have smaller hoses and ports, or if you have multiple blast gates, like I do, that you keep closed. These traditional dust collectors will draw fewer electrical amps under these conditions, reducing the sucking power. But this Dusk Gorilla uses Oneida's patented Smart Boost technology, which essentially increases the fan speed under those circumstances that I just mentioned to maintain a maximum suction power. Even to my limited technical understanding, I could see how much better a system like this is. Oneida has a wide range of dust collection systems for many different types of woodworking workshops, which I'll link to in the notes below this video. But rather than trying to figure it out for yourself, I would recommend just calling or emailing Oneida, tell them about your workshop, and they'll definitely help you find the best system for your particular workshop and for your machinery. I thought I had nailed down the best dust collection system for my workshop through my own research. I was looking at the Oneida Supercell high pressure dust collectors, but the guys at Oneida patiently explained the technicalities of why that wouldn't be the best option for my workshop and for my machines. These guys aren't trying to upsell you to the top, most expensive dust collection system. They really want you to get the one that works the best for your shop and for your machinery. And that was super impressive to me. Below, I'll also link to several articles that Oneida sent to me that really simplify a lot of the complicated things about dust collection that will help you understand more about choosing the right dust collection system for your woodworking shop. Remember how I tried and failed to convert my cheap dust collector into a two-stage Cyclone dust collector? Well, Oneida actually came up with a much better solution than what I did. Even though I was upgrading to the 5 horsepower Dusk Gorilla collection system, Oneida was nice enough to send me their Super Dust Deputy Cyclone conversion kit. It attaches to your single stage dust collector, and it properly separates the wood chips and sawdust into your garbage can or still drum. I tried that out on my old dust collector, and it worked much better than my DIY attempt at a Cyclone. Machines in my workshop are still too powerful for my old dust collector, so this isn't really a great option for me personally, but it may be a great option for woodworkers who are on a tight budget, who already have a single stage dust collector, and who don't have high-powered woodworking machines like I do. Someone maybe who has a 6-inch jointer rather than a 16-inch jointer. Oneida also sent me a smaller version of the Dust Deputy that's made for shop vacs. I thought this was really cool. This is working great for me because I use a shop vac when I'm using a power router or vacuuming in my workshop. I think it works awesome hooked up to a router table. Before I show you the video of setting up the Oneida Dusk Gorilla, I wanted to share one of the more ingenious dust collection inventions that Oneida sent to me. I had never heard of this before, and it was perfect for my traditional woodworking school, as I have 10 workbenches, and some of our classes involve extensive sanding and rasp work, and a lot of my personal projects too. So Oneida sent me a couple of their benchtop personal dust collectors to try out in my classes. This has really been a game changer here in my workshop. I simply set the dust collector on a workbench, I turn on the motor, and then I can start sanding or rasping. The powerful motor in this unit sucks the sawdust out of the air and into the filter. Now I don't have to do any hand sanding or power sanding in my workshop without a bench dust collector here on my workbench. It's really awesome. Hey, this is the process that I went through in ordering and setting up my new Dusk Gorilla dust collection system. I had a really great experience working with Oneida to design the perfect dust collection system for my workshop and for my machinery. We had several discussions about my machines, the measurements of my workshop, and the features that I wanted in a dust collector and ductwork here in my shop. The people at Oneida recommended the perfect system just catered for me. But after finalizing all the measurements, I was actually a bit nervous that the ductwork wouldn't fit. But the Oneida engineers are a lot smarter than I am, so it worked out amazingly well. Not long after we worked together on design, the boxes were shipped from New York to Virginia, and as you can see, it's a bit tricky for large delivery trucks to get into my driveway out on this country road. But this driver was amazingly good at backing in. And I was amazed to see how many boxes arrived in the shipment. Oneida was kind enough to send me some additional products to try out in my woodworking school, so I had towers of boxes in my shop. Fortunately, I was able to give them away to a friend who was moving. Everything was packed really well by Oneida, so nothing was damaged. With the help of the Oneida engineers, this was the spot that I decided to install my new Dusk gorilla, with the plan to run the ductwork up the south wall, along the ceiling, and down the north wall, next to my Felder planer and jointer. But this setup would require me to remove most of my lumber storage, so I had to remove the shelving from the wall here. But I had converted my chicken coop several years ago into woodshed, so it's not a big deal for me to lose space for lumber. It's actually kind of nice not having so much in here in my shop. Before I removed the lumber rack from the wall, I had run a 30 amp outlet from the electrical panel. And while I was at it, I ran another 20 amp outlet so I can run my air conditioner at the same time as my table saw. Yes, I originally made a mistake when I was hanging sheetrock in my workshop and didn't run enough outlets over here. So now I can actually use my table saw with air conditioning and not get drenched with sweat in the summertime. I was impressed by how thorough and simple the user manual was, which is really important for a non-technical guy like me. The shipment came with a handy template for leveling and hanging the wall brackets for the Dusk gorilla. After marking where the lag bolts would enter the wall stud, I used a cordless drill to bore pilot holes. Then we used a cordless impact driver to drive the lag bolts most of the way into the studs. And once the bracket was hanging on the lag bolts, we tightened them all the way. After fully assembling the wall bracket, we added a foam gasket to the cone. The gaskets keep dust from escaping into the air. I lifted the cone and barrel onto the wall brackets, and then we added bolts to fasten them together. We added another gasket to the top of the barrel for the next step, and then we tightened down the bolts between the cone and barrel. Then we added a foam gasket to the fan housing. We attached the fan housing to the barrel and fastened it down with more bolts. The motor assembly was very, very heavy, so I actually wouldn't recommend this method for most people, but I did carry it up a ladder and set it on top of the fan housing. I believe some other people rig up a pulley system to use their car to lift the motor assembly up there, but that sounded very time consuming to me, so I decided to try the brute force method. It worked for me, and I'm lucky I didn't get hurt, but don't push your luck. I aligned the motor assembly on the fan housing and attached the two parts using more bolts. I added some gasket to the filter plate and then attached the filter plenum elbow. Then two of my boys helped me attach the two parts with more bolts and nuts. Once they were tightened together, I lifted the elbow up against the fan housing. Then I bolted the elbow to the fan housing. Whenever possible, I like to let my kids help on projects like this so they can feel a sense of accomplishment when building or assembling something. Before fully tightening the nuts and bolts, we lifted the plenum support brace in place and tightened the top part of the brace in the top bolts. And the lower part we secured with a dedicated bolt that screws into the wall mount bracket. Next, we put the drop-in silencer into the HEPA cartridge filter. Then we assembled these clips. Make sure they look just like this. We'll come back to these clips here in a minute. But first, we set the stacking sound filter on top of the HEPA cartridge filter. Then we use these clips to attach the two parts, spacing them evenly around the circumference. Then we added another gasket on top of the stacking sound filter. To make things easier, I placed a cardboard box under where I'd be lifting the filter in place, and I added the J-bolts and thumb nuts to the filter plate. I set the assembled filter on top of the box and lowered the J-bolts until they hooked onto the stacking sound filter. As you can see here, this part is a bit tricky, and it took a few attempts to get all 4 J-bolts in place without one falling off. Once all 4 J-bolts were in place, I tightened down the thumb nuts. Then I added more of the J-bolts and thumb nuts to the fine dust bin, lifted it onto the bottom of the HEPA cartridge filter, and tightened the thumb nuts down. Next, I removed one of the top thumb nuts and added this braided ground wire to ground the filter. I attached the clip onto the wire frame of the filter. This helps prevent a static electricity fire around all the fine dust. Then my son attached the cone to the drum using a flexible hose and clamp bands. Hey, it's starting to look like a dust collector. We added another ground wire by screwing it into the metal lid and running the other end to the bottom end of the cone. Next, I opened up the starter panel and secured it to the wall with some screws. I then put the cover back on. Next, I removed the drum's lid clamp so I could install the cool Dusk Sentry that I mentioned earlier. This is the sensor that sets off a flashing light when the drum is getting full of sawdust. The Dusk Sentry just gets dropped into this hole, and the nut is tightened on the underside of the lid with a couple rubber washers. Then I attached the flashing light to a place where I'd be able to see it while using my machines. And the Dusk Sentry got plugged into a normal wall outlet. You can see it's flashing while empty, so I actually had to adjust it once it was almost filled with sawdust for the first time. Because I push all my machines backward on mobile bases when my classes are in session, I didn't want any ductwork hanging down from the ceiling in the middle of the shop. So I just ran a main line across the ceiling, connecting the ductwork from metal straps. And I worked with Oneida to design what I'll call stacks on either side of the shop. During installation, I decided to make a couple modifications to the ductwork, and Oneida was really cool about quickly shipping me some new ducting. Oneida's duct pipes are really high quality and offer a lot of flexibility, like with these flex joints. On all the joints, I connected the ducting with sheet metal screws and sealed them with special tape and sometimes silicone caulk. From each stack, I just ran flex hose from the blast gates to each machine. Each stack has a floor sweep where I can sweep wood shavings and sawdust that gets on the floor during classes or during my own personal projects. And here's what it looks like after finishing all the ductwork and after using it for a couple of months. This new dust collection system has been a game changer in my workshop. I'm happy to report that the nodules on my lungs didn't expand, so I'm most likely in the clear. But it did scare me enough to get serious about properly controlling the dust in my workshop. It's too bad it took that. But anyways, thanks for watching, and please subscribe to my YouTube channel and click the bell if you found this helpful, and we'll see you here next time in my workshop.
If you're interested in woodworking with a mix of hand tools and power tools, visit my website at woodandshop.com, where you can find a bunch of free woodworking lessons, workshop tours of amazing woodworkers, and our very popular tool buying guides. Make sure you subscribe to my free newsletter and check out my 10 steps for getting started in woodworking. Enjoy!